And so now they're trying to figure out, well, okay, you know, how long is this really going to be a problem for us? And it's an interplay between, you know, the uranium in the groundwater that's there and the uranium that's stored in the sediments, an exchange between those two components of the environment. Yeah.
Do you connect the communities surrounding these mining tailings to what you're doing? Are there public education programs for the communities that are dealing with these things?
Yeah, so again, that's not my area of expertise, but I can tell you a little bit about it. So the Department of Energy Legacy Management, they do have to take into account stakeholders when they design management strategies for these sites. So I've worked, I don't know about, there are a lot of sites too, and I've worked at about 4 of them. I can say that I worked at a site in Riverton, Wyoming that was on the Shoshone-Arapaho Reservation. And in that case, the Shoshone and the Arapaho were really involved in monitoring the sites as well. So there was a really good line of communication between DOELM and the tribes, at least when I was there. So there was, you know, I'm not sure they had educational outreach, but they definitely had community outreach.
There was
they would have,
connection,
they would have community meetings.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah. Yes.
Is the situation different for uranium that's not mined? It's just in the ground?
Is it?
Is that leaching in the same way and the same process?
So it really depends. There are a couple of different things I can think about. So there are currently in-situ mines where people pump down like the extractant that they're using to take the uranium out of the rock into the ground and pull up the uranium that way. So I guess that's still mining, but you're not excavating anything in that case. There's also, there can be sort of so-called natural uranium contamination, and some rocks are just elevated in uranium, and there is some concentration that's in the groundwater and it is elevated, and that's just the way it is. And then there's also an interesting instance where there's some rocks that are elevated in uranium, and because of farming practices, there's a lot of nitrate, so nitrate is in the fertilizer for the farms, and then that gets into the groundwater. And nitrate is actually really good at taking that uranium that's in the sediments, it's tetravalent uranium, uranium-4, and turning it into the form that's in the groundwater, which is hexavalent uranium. So there's actually been a recent study that came out that looked at the uranium concentrations, I think, in the Ogallala aquifer, which is that big aquifer that's in the middle of the country. It spans like all the plain states. And in that instance, they were able to find hotspots of uranium contamination in groundwater that were linked to hotspots of nitrate. So, so I guess the short answer to your question is yes, these processes occur just kind of naturally underground, and whether, you know, what exactly occurs in the set of uranium that you get in the groundwater has a lot to do about the local geology and the and then kind of the composition of the groundwater. That's
I guess
what
the question I was
sorry.
getting to is it worse after you mine it or before you mine it?
It's worse after you mine it. It's worse after you mine it, yeah. And definitely, like in the, I think the EPA just published new regulations on what's so-called in-situ mining, where they pump the extractant down into the ground.
You want to catch your breath?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, thank you.
Have a sip.
I think I saw a question. Oh, yes.
Are there chemicals, compounds that are not amenable? I'm thinking about, for example, a lot of groundwater contamination is from petroleum. Are there bacteria that are going to eat anything, or are there classes of chemicals and compounds that are not amenable to this?
That's a good question. So I would say in general, bacteria can pretty much eat anything. Like, I don't think that's strictly true, but as a rule of thumb, bacteria eat a lot of stuff. They do eat petroleum, and they can be important components in degrading, like in the Gulf of Mexico and degrading.
It's the only way you can explain bacteria surviving in these totally inevitable deep ocean places.
Yeah, it's really true. They're extremely versatile, and they will find a way. I would say so. You can think of it more broadly in terms of there's this idea about persistent organic chemicals. That's another kind of class of contaminants that are in the environment. And so people think about organics that persist in the environment as organics that are are less reactive with bacteria or with some other reactive environmental material like a mineral. So there is like a range of sort of reactivities and a range of persistence that exists out there. And I think I remember learning that some of the most persistent organic compounds are the fluorinated hydrocarbons that they actually coat on food wrappers to keep, so it makes it hydrophobic so you don't, or it keeps like grease and stuff from getting on your fingers when you eat your hamburger or whatever. And whatever compound they use is really resistant to degradation, and so it can persist for a long time.
So a lot of the, in New Orleans, the water comes from the Mississippi River, and they actually put extra chlorine in the water to make sure there's no bacteria by the time it actually gets to the water. So all this bacteria reacts with these organic impurities in the water system and makes these halocarbons, which we were just talking about.
Yeah.
And it's difficult for them to break it. So they did a study in New Orleans, and they said about 63 new carcinogens were being created
Yeah.
as a result of extra chlorine being put in the water.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, that's
So-
really true. That's one of the downsides of chlorine disinfection that we use in the
So
US.
chances of you having cancer if you were drinking tap water in New Orleans is about 40% higher compared to the number.
Oh, really? Oh, wow. That's
So you mentioned mercury, going back to mercury, and that the salt of mercury is the precursor to the method of mercury, the bacteria and the sediments. How does mercury from the coal burning, which is elemental, would it not be, how does that convert to mercury salt in the sediment? Is that bacteria doing that too?
It's a range of processes. So, I mean, there's basically just a lot of reactions out there in the atmosphere that can take the metallic mercury and turn it back into the salt. So, typically, actually, when mercury is deposited from the atmosphere back onto the land surface, it's already been converted into the salt, so into mercury, divalent mercury, mercury 2, by the time it's made it onto land. I'm not super familiar with mercury biogeochemistry in the atmosphere. My guess is that most of those reactions are dominated by inorganic reactions, probably on the particle or on the surfaces of aerosols. That's where a lot of atmospheric reactions occur. But it makes it to the bacteria as in the 2 form. That's typically the most stable.
So I know mercury isn't exactly your element of expertise, but how are we, I mean, it seems to me that a couple decades ago, it was just horrendous, the mercury contamination in fish. Is it better now? Or is it not really, because there's still so much coal being burned and so much of it getting into the food chain?
Yeah, I don't think it's gotten any better. I haven't done a survey of the literature recently, but no, I would say I don't think it's gotten better. If something has changed, it's probably been the public outreach on it. But
Well, you don't hear
recently,
about it
I
that
forget
much. No, you
exactly when this happened. It was within the last 5 years. The EPA passed new regulatory limits on mercury emissions, so mercury coming out of power plants.
Here, in the United States?
In the United
Yes.
States. So that can actually,
That could help.
that could really help. Of course, mercury is really a global problem because it can be transported long distances. So, you know, if we burn a lot of coal in China,
Absolutely.
we're going to get a lot of mercury
Which
in
they
the
do.
too eventually.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's still a problem.
Yeah.
And then, I mean, it also depends on where you are locally. If you were interested in eating local fish, then it's totally dependent on
And
the
it,
site.
like you mentioned, it's totally a food chain problem
Mhm.
where it gets concentrated more and more and more the higher you go up in the food chain. So if the fish are farmed, if there's a way to farm the fish and they were being fed something that was a controlled substance rather than something wild, then you might have a chance of eating those fish.
Well, I mean, I think as a good rule of thumb, eating fish lower down the food chain and avoiding the super top predators.
Yeah.
And if you were really concerned about it, then like the EPA website will list particular species that are the most, have been found to be the most concentrated, so you can avoid those.
So it was tuna, right? Right, Rid? I'm remembering.
Yeah.
Isn't that right?
Swordfish.
It was sword.
Okay.
Yeah.
Probably shark.
Although we weren't known for eating that much shark here that we knew of. Right? All those scallops. Right.
Sorry?
No, I can imagine sharks become even more popular, or it did there for a while.
I used to carry a card for a website, Go Fish or something, that gave, you know, what the current recommendations were, is the to the least hazardous fish.
Yeah. Yeah.
Went to the internet searches and tried to find that to the least hazardous fish. Yeah.
For those of us who couldn't hear, could you summarize the exchange of the guy in the yellow shirt?
Oh.
Most of us didn't hear.
I'm sorry. He said that there is a resource called Go Fish, which will list the fish that are least hazardous to eat or most beneficial to consume, that are likely to have the lowest mercury concentrations, and probably other contaminants as well, because there are a number of different types of contaminants that have the same behavior as mercury, where they build up as you go to higher trophic levels.
I met the proprietor over there.
Okay. So what he was saying was that in the United States, we add chlorine to our water to disinfect it. And depending on where you are, I guess in New Orleans, they add a lot of chlorine.
The EPA says that by the time the water comes out of the tap, it should have zero bacteria. So that is why if the travel time from the filtration plant to the house is larger than, let's say, 25, 30 minutes, then they actually add extra chlorine so that the chlorine could fight off the bacteria which basically gets generated during the travel time. So if the water filtration plant, unlike Los Alamos, for example, were to be really far, there's a higher travel time. So they have to add extra chlorine into it. And piping system in infrastructure in US is quite old actually. There's estimate that we need about $1.5 trillion to actually change all that system. So there is a lot of organics, impurities in the pipelines. So that chlorine reacts with the organics and makes halocarbons, which are basically pesticides, which have been banned for forever. And almost all the halocarbons are known to be carcinogens. So in about, I think 2004, they did a study in New Orleans where they identified 63 new carcinogens being generated in the water as a result of that extra chlorine. So if you were to, filtration units like Brita can't do anything about it. Just because these are molecular impurities and they're passed by billion levels, they do actually pass through the filter. And if you have that kind of carcinogens, and EPA actually, except California, doesn't even have a regulation system in place for those carcinogens right now. So only California is a country which actually has how many maximum halocarbons you can have in the water. So it's a huge problem, and I think the same things are being used on some of the food packaging. That's what you were saying, I think.
Yeah. Or those are fluorinated.
Yeah, so halocarbons, any chlorines or fluorines basically attached to the carbon chain.
It must be exciting and interesting to find a field, a new field that you're so ignorant about. That it's going to hold well for a while. How long until the field matures enough that it will be boring? How long will you understand biogeochemistry processes?
Wait, sorry, so how long until we understand biogeochemical processes?
How long until the science catches up?
So I'm going to be employed forever. No, I would say there's actually, I mean, it's a really big and interesting field. And only recently, there's been some really interesting advances that should give us some really great insight into how and why biogeochemical processes operate in particular environments. So in particular, people have started to do whole genome sequencing where they're able to figure out, where they're able to reconstruct the genome, not of a microbe in the subsurface, but a genome of the entire microbial community in the subsurface. And then they can back out information about the diversity of the different types of microbes that live there, and the diversity of biochemical pathways that they exhibit, and thus how they can modify their environment and the types of environments they can live in. So there's now a push to try to figure out how we can, we used to model biogeochemical processes by saying, okay, well, we know the pH, we know the redox potential, we know these concentrations, we know there are bacteria present, we can generate the simple model. So we're now moving from that to doing, there are groups who are doing research to figure out how we can figure out, okay, well, we know these genes are present. What impact on the environment are these genes going to have? And I would say that's probably one of the most exciting things that's happening in the field, and it's gonna, that is just kind of at its beginning. Yeah.
So are you able to use computer modeling, or is there just too many variables that are still unknown?
Oh, no, people use computer modeling, and they use it in a variety of ways. One really big way is that people will develop models that take into account the hydrology and the chemistry and the biology of the system, and they can combine that all together and try to predict the concentrations of whatever element they're interested in, and they can try to predict what form it'll be in. And those, you can have different levels of complexity of those models, and depending on the system and the complexity of the model, get better or worse answers. Yeah. But there's a lot of computer modeling that goes into it.
And then I wanted to ask about funding. So I can understand that DOE would want to fund something like the uranium legacy issues. But who funds for the mercury, and do you have a lot of interactions with the EPA?
So I don't personally have a lot of interactions with the EPA, and I would say mercury contamination is kind of like it's kind of problematic because it's really difficult to control. There are certain areas that are contaminated. For instance, it used to be that the San Francisco Bay had a ton of contamination because there was all this mercury mining and use of mercury in gold mining. But that's only one source. Most of mercury contamination is just this really diffuse release of mercury into the environment. And these concentrations are not, you can't remediate them. They're just there. You can't, there's not really a technology available to, to really address the, mercury accumulating in fish. Other than, say, regulating the amount of mercury that comes out of power plants. So that was the EPA's approach, is to regulate mercury at its source before it gets into the environment, and that really is the approach you have to take instead of trying to deal with the contamination after the fact. Yes?
I'm curious, what process did you personally have to go through to become a postdoc at Los Alamos, Washington?
What process?
Yes.
I met with my mentor every week for several months before he accepted me into his lab. That's
well, so you're
meetings.
Right.
Process
when you were
of
still in grad
meetings.
school, you saw calls for postdocs or whatever, right?
So I actually came into this field because doing the work that I do, I became very good at implementing a set of tools that allow me to investigate the chemical form in really complicated matrices and at very dilute concentrations. So these are using techniques that are, synchrotron-based techniques. So you use a particle accelerator to generate X-rays and use those high-intensity X-rays to probe your materials. It's a very particular technique that has a lot of applications, and I became an expert at that. And so that allowed me, I actually did that during my PhD, and then I worked at a synchrotron in a previous postdoc position and gained a lot of expertise using a variety of tools at that facility. And then I leveraged that to come and work at Los Alamos and do some very chemistry, sort of inorganic chemistry related problems.
Synchrotron were you working at?
San Francisco Synchrotron Radiation Light Source in Palo Alto, or Menlo Park.
Do you see yourself staying here at Los Alamos for a long time? I mean, will we have the kind of research program that you're interested in pursuing? Let's not say, they're going to say, they're going to, are you going to want them? Are they going to have the kind of program that's going to keep you here for what you're interested in? Maybe not. Maybe you need to go somewhere else. Just what do you
I've
think?
only been here 5 months, so I'm still exploring the laboratory. But they
Oh,
haven't
no,
really-
you can know